Dr. Foster, the questions I'm going to ask you now have been suggested to me by core participants, and so they won't follow any particular chronological or thematic sequence. They will dot around from topic to topic. First question is this: what does the process of scaling up of a viral inactivation process involve?
It means moving from a laboratory scale procedure to a full manufacturing scale procedure in a way that is defined and controllable, so that you can be assured that the outcome will be the same on every occasion.
Then turning to the Northern Irish plasma that was transported to PFC and fractionated, you referred to some validation studies being done on that plasma from Northern Ireland. What did those studies show?
They showed that the plasma behaved the same as Scottish plasma.
I asked you about factor 8 assays developed using haemophiliac blood, or rather I think I asked you about the use of blood from haemophiliacs, and you referred to their use for factor 8 assays. What were those assays used for at PFC or more widely? They
were used to determine the amount of factor 8 present in any solution, whether it was the final product, an intermediate product, whether it was in research studies into how to manufacture or develop factor 8. Wherever we did a factor 8 assay, you had to have that substrate present as part of the assay, otherwise you could make no measurements of factor 8.
And was that something being done within PFC, or are you talking about a wider use?
It was used in all factor 8 assays in every laboratory in the world at that time.
Can we go to PRSC 0001201? This is your March 1983 presentation at the Edinburgh Royal Infirmary. And if we just go to page 6, I'd asked you about the inactivation of viruses earlier, but can I just ask you about the reference to accredited donors? What did you have in mind there as a potential method of preventing hepatitis transmission?
I think that's what Dr. Smith was talking about, that you would be able to somehow have a donor who had donated blood many times and had been found not to transmit non-A, non-B, and therefore could be plasmapheresed in order to provide a supply of plasma. And I think ultimately he found that wasn't able to be taken forward at any scale.
So Dr. Smith's statements told us about the green fall plasmapheresis collected by Dr. Robinson.
Yes.
That's what you were referring
to. That's the same thing, yes.
And then turning to the heat treatment process in use from December 1984, what was the basis upon which the effectiveness of the dry heat treatment process applied to eradicate HTLV3 judged?
Initially, it was whether there was any feedback from the haemophilia doctors about whether there were any further transmissions of HIV. Ultimately, we were able to obtain HIV itself and do laboratory studies in our virology laboratory. But that took a long time because we couldn't obtain HIV at first in this country. So that was much later before we could do those studies to finally confirm from laboratory studies that what we were doing was fully effective.
What in vitro and in vivo evidence was there of its effectiveness?
So you're talking about HIV again?
Yes.
It's pretty much what I've just said, that the in vivo would be the patient, reports from patients that the haemophilia directors were dealing with. The in vitro would be studies where we could take virus in the laboratory, add it to factor 8, heat it, and then see if the virus had been destroyed or not. But we needed a virology containment suite to do that. We needed a supply of virus to do that. And we needed permission to do that because at first the Scottish Executive wouldn't allow us to do that work because they were concerned that we might infect the PFC product. And it took some persuasion to allow us to do that work in our virology containment suite.
And can you recall roughly when it was you were able to start that
that would have been the late 1980s.
Were any efforts made to access LAV from the Montagnier group in 1983 or 84?
Yes, Dr. Cuthbertson did try to do that. I think he contacted them, but had no reply.
Is it possible, I appreciate it involves a degree of hypothesis and speculation, but if you had been able to obtain that through Dr. Cuthbertson, might work involving the study of the virus have allowed earlier breakthroughs in relation to heat treatment?
I think it's unlikely that we would have done that before Bayer. I think they were more advanced in doing that than we were. I think the difficulty with LAV is when that work was first published in 1983, it really went under the radar. I think if that had been appreciated at the time, then studies like that might have been done sooner, but they probably wouldn't have been done at PFC. They would have been done by Montagnier himself or by people like Baxter or Bayer. But that went under the radar. It wasn't really until the Gallo work that it was appreciated that that was the cause of AIDS.
What was it about the BPL freeze-drying process for 8Y that allowed the product to be heated to 80 degrees?
Ultimately, we discovered it was the crystal structure of the ice that was formed during the freezing process. And if you could get the correct crystal structure, you could apply that to fibrinogen. And we went on to produce 80-degree heated-treated fibrinogen. After that, once we'd made that discovery, that it was the crystal structure of the ice during the freezing process. And it was a very precise crystal structure, and we had to work out how to get that on every occasion in every vial. And we worked out a way of doing that.
And then I asked you about the infection from immunoglobulin. How could viral cross-contamination of immunoglobulins occur after the virus inactivation step?
Because there's further processing takes place within the same facility. And this was before donors were screened for hepatitis C because the virus hadn't been discovered. And so any prevention of cross-contamination had to be dealt with by very strict procedures to avoid cross-contamination. And somehow those procedures must have fallen down. We don't know exactly what happened, but that was our only conclusion. And I think there was a review of that, which I wasn't involved in, but Dr. Cuthbertson was, and to really go through everything and tighten up everything that they possibly could. And it comes down to staff training as well as procedures, making sure that everything was done perfectly so there was no possibility of cross-contamination, and it never happened again.
Could that have happened in relation to factor concentrates?
If we'd had a factor concentrate that was treated like pasteurization in solution, that was always a risk.
Prior to the introduction of heat-treated concentrates from December 1984 in Scotland, are you aware of any studies in animals that had suggested that heat treatment might be effective?
Chimpanzee studies in the United States, but that work wasn't reproduced in patients. So there was for some reason, the chimp studies did not replicate what happened in humans. Why that was the case, I don't think was ever determined.
Do you know whether PFC products were ever exported or sold to other countries? Leave aside Northern Ireland, England and Wales, exported beyond the United Kingdom.
We did, much later on, we had surplus albumin that was sold to India at cost price because they had shortages of albumin and we had surplus. There was immunoglobulin, intravenous immunoglobulin that we sold to England because we had surplus and they wanted that product. They preferred ours to the commercial products. So there were periods, and this is really much later than the periods we've been talking about, where PFC had surplus products that it was allowed to sell overseas or to England in order to justify the economies of PFC.
Are you aware of factor concentrates having been sold beyond the UK in the 70s or 80s?
No.
Turning then to the the capacity of PFC to fractionate plasma. I asked you about whether, in your view, PFC could have fractionated a third of the plasma from England and Wales, and you said yes. So that we're clear, was that based upon PFC's effective capacity, i.e. the existing setup, or its potential capacity with the 3-shift working pattern and the use of the CSVM?
It's a potential capacity.
And did your answer that the PFC could have fractionated a third of the plasma from England and Wales also take account of the fact that the PFC was fractionating Northern Irish plasma?
Yes.
You told us in relation to giving evidence to the Archer inquiry yesterday that you volunteered to give evidence because you strongly believed that patients deserved to know the truth of what had happened. What did you mean by that? In other words, what was the truth that you thought patients were entitled to know?
I would say that I can't give a full answer to that, and it's the sort of area this inquiry has been looking into and covering why England, for example, why England wasn't self-sufficient and things like that.
You told us, this is now talking about the information sharing with BPL more generally. I think you told us about BPL had a knowledge of the plant setup at PFC. Do you know of any practical reason why BPL couldn't have replicated the system you had at the PFC?
No, and it was part of the discussions in 1980 when we went through all of the different technologies that might be adopted at the new BPL, and that was one that Mr. Watt was very keen that BPL should adopt, but they rejected it.
And when you say that, you're talking about the CSVM?
Yes.
To your knowledge, could the CSVM process have been established in the undeveloped BPL?
I'm not entirely sure, but it's a possibility. I would say even then it wouldn't have met the requirements for the medicines inspectors because the building itself was too old.
This is then in relation to batch process and pool sizes. And I'm just going to read to you the question, and I hope you may be able to answer it. If at PFC you'd wanted to reduce pool sizes but still maintain productivity, would it have been possible to install a second tank so that the same amount of plasma could be processed within 2 batches?
The problem wasn't in the initial processing, the problem was in the dispensing of the product, and that the products have to be dispensed in an aseptic dispensing suite, which is a sterile room. And according to the GMP requirements, one batch of one product can only be dispensed in 1 work session. And the amount of work involved meant there was only 1 batch of any product could be dispensed in 1 day. We had over a dozen different products. And the only way we could increase output was to increase pool size. We actually dispensed 2 batches of factor 8 a week. And the only way we could increase the pool size, increase output, was by increasing pool size. With that system, if we'd reduced the pool size, we'd have had to reduce output.
Can I then take you back to Stockholm again, 1983? You referred to a brief conversation with Professor Bloom. Do you have any recollection as to whether that was before or after the presentation that Dr. Everett had given?
It was after.
You also, in one of your memos from Stockholm, I don't think we need to go back to it, but you referred to US manufacturers and clinicians doing their utmost to play the situation down, or words to that effect. One, I think, perhaps can understand that in relation to US manufacturers. In relation to clinicians, did you get any sense of why US clinicians were trying to play the situation down?
I think they were in denial. I think that they, or it was wishful thinking, is another way to put it, that I think the outcome of AIDS being a transmissible agent that was affecting people with haemophilia was so hard for them to grasp because the implications were so severe, they kind of didn't want to know.
I'd asked you about the 1975 World in Action documentary, and you said you'd saw it and there was talk about it, and you reminded me that Mr. Watt had been in it. Do you recall whether you had any conversations about that documentary with colleagues at BPL, or counterparts, I should say, at BPL?
I don't recall that.
I asked you about your comment to the Lindsay Tribunal, where you said, I think we knew it was just a matter of time, and I asked you who the we were, and I haven't got the precise transcript, but you essentially were talking about your colleagues at PFC, I think. Did you get any sense, again from your dialogue with counterparts at BPL, whether that was a view shared by them, by Dr. Smith and his colleagues, or Dr. Lane or others?
I'm not sure I can answer that.
One of the themes of the evidence you gave to Penrose inquiry and indeed in others was the concern that commercial concentrates posed a higher risk of infection than domestic concentrates, and hence the importance of self-sufficiency. And you referred, amongst other things, to the risk from paid donors, from lower socioeconomic groups who may have a reason not to want to be candid about being in high-risk categories. Did you have any particular knowledge or concern about collection of blood from prisoners in US penitentiaries? I
didn't know how the plasma was collected in the States to that level of detail.
We've touched on a couple of occasions in the course of your evidence on the position in relation to York Hill Hospital, which used, in a number of years, significantly greater quantities of commercial concentrates than other haemophilia centres in Scotland. As far as you know, in the late 70s and early 80s, would PFC have had any difficulty in supplying all of York Hill's requirements for concentrate?
I think in the report that I prepared for Penrose on self-sufficiency, there were some periods where we couldn't meet the full amount for concentrate. But my personal view is that priority should have been given to children. So I would have thought York Hill should have had access to that material.
And then we've seen, I think, set out in one or two documents your understanding that mild and moderate haemophiliacs were being treated with cryoprecipitate rather than concentrates. Are you able to assist us with the source of your understanding? What was that based on?
It was based, I believe there have been recommendations from the HCDO to that effect. But obviously I'm not being directly involved in treating patients, right. So I can't really say more than that.
We see it referenced, I think, in contemporaneous documents. So is it fair to say, whatever the source, it was your belief that was the case?
Yes.
And was that, do you think, based upon an assumption that was the right and obvious thing to do, or are you not able to say?
It was the right and obvious thing to do because there was a lower risk. And if the patients were not being treated frequently, if they were treated very occasionally, then that was at this point in time, when there was so much uncertainty about risk with concentrates, that would have been the appropriate thing to do if it was suitable for that particular condition that was being treated.
And then I think you referred in your evidence today to PFC having identified a superior stabiliser for factor concentrate. What was that stabiliser, and had it been used previously to stabilise anything else?
The stabiliser was a sugar called sorbitol. Edinburgh were using sucrose, and we found sorbitol to be superior. I'm not aware that it would have been used before as a stabiliser.
And then you've explained your understanding in relation to Beringwork, or the origin of Beringwork's work, that it was a degree of serendipity, stumbling upon something whilst doing something else. What's is there any particular written material that you're aware of that sets that out?
Yes, there were depositions by the scientist who made that discovery called Horst Swin, and I had copies of his deposition, and it was in 2 volumes, and I've provided the inquiry with the first volume, but unfortunately I'd forgotten there were 2 volumes, and when I was leaving PFC, when I was retiring, I wanted to keep a personal copy of these, but I'd forgotten there were 2 volumes, so I only retained 1 copy of the first volume, so I haven't got the second volume.
Okay. Well, maybe the inquiry can obtain that from elsewhere. Dr. Foster, those are the questions I'm proposing to ask from the suggestions I've received from 4 participants. Sir, do you have any questions for Dr. Foster?
Well, only one, really, which arises out of one of the questions that you've just asked. And it's to do with the GMP requirement not to dispense more than 1 batch in a day. The reason for that would be what, cross-contamination or?
They say 1 working session.
Yes.
Then they define what they mean by that, and it's about the operators and the procedures, and essentially they mean the room needs to be fumigated and cleaned out before you start again. So you start with a room that's validated as sterile, and then you don't do anything else until you revalidate the room as being sterile and do whatever procedures are needed to achieve that. And I was never involved directly with any of that, but it's my understanding that that was so onerous, all of that, that we could only ever do 1 batch of 1 product a day. Now, the other aspect...
That presumably is because you only had 1 room.
That's exactly right.
So if you'd had more than 1 room, you could have done more than 1 batch.
We could have done 2 batches if we'd had 2 rooms, yes.
And three batches if you had 3.
Exactly. The other point is that the freeze dryer had to fit with that as well, because that concept extended to the freeze dryer. You could only freeze dry 1 batch in 1 freeze dryer at a time. So if freeze drying limited your capacity, and you had to get bigger and bigger freeze dryers, in order to use your capacity, you had to fill the freeze dryer. So you've got 2 completely different approaches. One is going to be having a huge number of small freeze dryers and a huge number of small sterile filling rooms, or 1 big room and 1 big freeze dryer, or 2 big freeze dryers, which is what we had. And PFC was built to handle these large quantities. It wasn't built to handle large numbers of small batches. That was the contradiction.
I see.
The difference with PFL, with Dr. Smith, is that at PFL they were only handling coagulation factors, and of the coagulation factors, the one that was far and away the most important was factor 8, and therefore he might have been able to process more factor 8 through his system than we were able to, because he was just focusing on that one thing.
Yes.
And that's why he was more interested in the idea of the small pool, because it was perhaps something that was achievable in his facility.
So it would have given him no real problem in the way of process, whereas exactly. You had no problem with the theory of it, but you had a problem with the process.
Exactly.
Yes. Thank you. That's all that I ask.
So your reference to freeze dryers has reminded me that there was a point, I think during the course of Mr. Bucra's presentation earlier in the week, in which you raised a question about the shelves in the freeze dryer. This was in the context of capacity and ability to store bottles. I can't now remember what the
point was this.
Question was.
At one stage, I think you had a problem with the freeze dryer, that you had you wanted more capacity, you didn't have it in the freeze dryer, and so you had to reduce the size of the bottle.
That's correct.
And it's what an example I think you give in your witness statement of the cooperation which there was at a junior level between Scotland and England.
Well, it was the production manager who made the arrangement.
And he sorted out with his counterpart down south.
Yes.
So instead of having big bottles, you had small bottles, and then therefore you could fit more shelves in.
It was just slightly smaller, but it was enough to make the room for the extra shelf.
Yes. Well, I think those of us who've used ovens and had lots of shelves and tried to fit in various bits of food will know exactly what the problem is, albeit in a very different process. That's the sort of thing you're describing, isn't it?
Yes.
Thank you.
Dr. Foster, is there anything further that you wanted to add?
Just as a final comment.
Yes.
I would like to just first of all say that in my witness statement, and the associated documents, there's a lot of information. And I'd be very happy to assist the inquiry and any of the core participants if they have any further questions, and to do that through the inquiry. I'd also like to say that I believe that what happened to the haemophilia community and all of the infected and affected by this, what has happened, was a really terrible tragedy. And I have always believed that the patients and their families deserve to know what happened, they deserve the full truth of what happened, and I sincerely hope this inquiry can achieve that.
Thank you. Sir.
Well, I just like to thank you very much indeed for being here, coming down from the north in order to be here. We're very grateful. I can see exactly why it is, both that you have been as plainly as willing as you have been to give evidence generally and to contribute what you have to say from a very particular perspective, that of the scientist and engineer, with comments therefore both on the science and the engineering process, which has been really helpful to us. But it's plain to me also why Archer and Penrose and Lindsay should all have wanted you to give evidence, and you've now done the Grand Slam. So thank you very much for that. So
that completes today. We resume on Tuesday with the evidence of Dr. Snape, who will be able to assist us in furthering our understanding of BPL. That's Tuesday and Wednesday.
And he will be remote, I think.
He will be giving evidence remotely. And then we return to the PFC on Thursday and Friday with the evidence of Dr. Perry, who will be giving evidence here in person.
Yes, so it's 10 o'clock on Tuesday.